The rivalry ended with Trotsky's exile from the country and his eventual murder. Stalin seized secret police, the Cheka, and set it in motion in a series of show trials against practically all leaders of the Bolsheviks who had supervised the revolution. By 1929, Stalin had completely seized control over the country. He expropriated land from the peasants and drove them into cooperatives, so-called collective farms. Rich peasants, the so-called kulaks, were executed or forced into Siberian exile. The collectivization of agriculture led to unprecedented famine. Millions of peasants died. It was only one of the greatest tragedies in Stalin's time of office. Having imposed unreasonable taxes on the peasantry, Stalin raised funds for the country's industrialization. Power stations and factories were promptly erected and mines were excavated. The country changed rapidly. It was the ideal totalitarian state with full control over all aspects of life, even over people's thoughts. In the conditions of total ideological control, a new type of person was created, the Homo Sovieticus, who was an obedient small screw in the huge state machine. Any dissent, and even suspicion of dissent, was punished most severely. People were killed or imprisoned for a slow death in Siberia, in the country's north. The prisoners' slave labor was used to build the new state for building bright future. The heads of the armed forces, marshals and generals, most of the officers of the Red Army were executed. After torture, all of them confessed to absolutely improbable crimes: espionage, sabotage, treason. At this time in Europe, the Nazi regime, which was led by another ruthless dictator, Adolf Hitler, began to gather strength. Hitler managed to deceive his rival. In 1939, Germans waged war in Europe, preliminarily having concluded a non-aggression pact with Russia. But Hitler hoodwinked Stalin, and in 1941 perfidiously attacked the Soviet Union. Stalin hastened to form an alliance with those already at war with Germany, England, and the United States. The anti-Hitler coalition formed. Having been deprived of skilled military leaders and officers with combat experience, the Red Army was at first completely disorganized and retreated almost all the way to the Volga in panic. But the Russian people showed unprecedented persistence and patriotism. Bearing incalculable losses, it is considered that Russia lost about 20 million people in World War II. But the Red Army gradually became truly national and managed to change the course of the war. After the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, the ensuing counterattack resulted not only in the liberation of all the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, but also in the military actions in Germany. In 1945, the Allies celebrated a historic victory in World War II. The prize in this victory for the Soviet Union was not only the return of the Soviet territory, but also the countries of Eastern Europe, which Germany gave up under the terms of its surrender. In 1949, after the war with Japan, besides Russia, China and North Korea joined the so-called socialist camp. This resulted in a confrontation with Western countries led by the US, which was represented in Soviet propaganda as the ultimate evil. There were times when the conflict threatened to turn into World War III with the use of nuclear weapons. At that time, the huge Soviet propaganda apparatus created the cult of Stalin, the great leader and the father of the people of all progressive mankind, endowed with unreal abilities. And here, at the peak of power and glory, Stalin died, according to some sources, liquidated by conspirators from his inner circle. Even in death, the leader, the tyrant, and the murderer claimed more victims. Thousands of people died in a stampede during his funeral. It is paradoxical, but the influence of propaganda penetrated the consciousness so deeply that most people mourned over his death and continued to love him for many years. As the result of a short struggle for power, after the liquidation of State Security Minister Lavrentiy Beria, the pragmatic Nikita Khrushchev came to power. At first, he operated by using Stalin's methods to get rid of all his colleagues in the Politburo, but nobody was persecuted. In addition, having attained political power, he gave a historical address detailing Stalin's crimes at the 20th Party Congress. In general, Khrushchev was not too educated and was rather inconsistent, sometimes allowing himself quite exotic actions like attempting to sow the entire country with corn or pounding on a table with his shoe at the General Assembly of the United Nations. But during his time in office, the first man-made satellite was launched, as well as the first manned spaceflight carried out by the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. He brought the country to the brink of world war with the Berlin and Cuban missile crises. But he was also the first Soviet head of state to visit America. During his time in office, there was a so-called Khrushchev thaw, when more liberal conventions became possible in literature and art, and the names of new young writers, artists, musicians became known. And having been frightened, Khrushchev restored the rigid party control over the sphere of life. He promised to bury America, and in a flash of enlightenment, he decided to get rid of the domination of the party nomenclatura, for which this nomenclatura discharged him from power in 1964. Led by Leonid Brezhnev, the conspirators against Khrushchev took power of the government, and the subsequent years became known as the era of stagnation. The basic idea of the almost 20-year period, when party officials, generals, and the strengthened KGB was in power, consisted in protecting what they inherited, the preservation of the Red Empire. Therefore, confrontation with the West continued. The Cold War ebbed and flowed. The national economy mostly depended on the sale of raw materials to the West, mainly oil. And when Ronald Reagan came to power in the US, with the exacerbating of the arms race and oil prices rapidly falling, a most severe economic crisis came about. Brezhnev died in 1982. The increasingly disrupted leadership at first put forward the influential former head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, to replace Brezhnev. After Andropov's death, there was one more elderly leader, Chernenko, who also soon died. These were infirm, old people. It was obvious that the country needed a young leader. The old men in the leadership were compelled to call Mikhail Gorbachev to power, and he energetically got down to business, quickly changed the party leadership and the government, and began to carry out reforms. The course of the so-called perestroika, or reorganization, was declared, meaning reorganization of the country's public and governmental order.
А то все говорят, а что такое перестройка? Что такое перестройка? Свое дело делать честно. Главная перестройка.
The people liked the young leader. He could speak without reading from a piece of paper, and he held promise. He established partner relations with the West. East Germany and the so-called socialist countries found freedom during the Gorbachev era. Gorbachev's liberal reforms naturally caused discontent among conservative circles. In 1991, they staged a coup. There were tanks on the streets of Moscow. Despite the fact that practically the entire leadership at the time participated in the plot, the putsch ended in the utter defeat because the conspirators had no plan or any real offers of change for the better. The putsch left the country practically without leadership, which the increasingly bolder heads of national republics used to their advantage. The republics seceded and became independent of Russia. The paradox of history was that upon returning to Moscow, the triumphant Gorbachev turned out to be the president of a now non-existent country, and the favorite of the people, Boris Yeltsin, became the new president of Russia at the time. Undoubtedly, Yeltsin's first merit is that given the general disorder, he did not resort to military confrontation with the former republics or with the conservative communist opposition. It was a peaceful dismantling of the empire.
Мы все сделали выбор в пользу мирного, правового, демократического способа преобразований.
Yeltsin's second undoubtable merit was that his term in office was a time of freedom and celebration of democracy. After the times of totalitarianism and the era of stagnation, most people were shocked at the freedom which spread across the country. Society broke in two, and supporters of the former regime, Annie, and all conservatives and nationalists were in the majority. Yeltsin had to overcome a set of crises and even an armed rebellion in 1993. Nevertheless, he manifested outstanding political instincts, decisiveness, and sometimes also cunning, so he was able to cope with the situation without reprisals. The pro-communist parliament deprived him of practically half his power and budgetary funds. Therefore, Yeltsin was forced to ask for support to a number of new capitalists who had grown rich in those nebulous times. When it seemed that the majority of difficulties were in the past and the country was moving forward, a financial crisis developed and resulted in a default. Bankruptcy, loss of bank deposits, companies stopping operations and non-payment of salaries created a good opportunity for the opposition to attack. Perhaps such a skilled politician as Yeltsin would again find a way, but under the constitution, the second term of his presidency came to an end in 2000, and the neo-communists could surely come to power. And even in this situation, Yeltsin shows his exclusive political acumen one last time. He appoints himself a successor, former KGB officer Vladimir Putin. Exhausted with constant confrontation between executive power and parliament, the constant tension and conflicts, society enthusiastically supported the new president.
Из этого кабинета видно, что наша страна нуждается в реконструкции для того, чтобы иметь будущее.
In his first term as head of state, Putin basically continued Yeltsin's policies, but gradually he began to show greater and greater independence. Circumstances developed in the best way for him. In parliament, the majority belonged to his supporters. Putin settled the conflict in the Chechen Republic. Putin's 8 years in office were a fortuitous time for Russia. Putin transferred the powers of the president to Dmitry Medvedev and himself assumed the post of prime minister. He remains an influential leader. Let's hope and believe that the mighty power of Russia will only have good luck in the future.